Hey everyone, and welcome to the 30 Days of Courage. I'm your host, Ashley Easter. I am the founder and executive director of Courage 365, and I'm so excited that you've decided to join us today. So, if this is your first time joining one of our live videos, maybe you've come specifically because you know Chrissy Stroop is speaking, and Chrissy is amazing. And if that is you, welcome. We are glad you're here for this talk. But also know you're kind of jumping in on the middle of a month-long event that we have called the 30 Days of Courage. So for the whole month of October, right here inside this Facebook group, we have speakers all month long. During the weeks, we have self-care challenges and prizes. And then in addition to that, we also have support groups on the weekends and so many other wonderful things. We've got free resources that we're giving away and just a bunch of cool stuff. This past week, we challenged you to make a list of 3 things that makes your morning better, and then challenged you to do those 3 things every morning so your day starts off right. And I'm so excited. I loved seeing what you do in your morning. Everybody's morning is a little bit different. The things that excite us, the things that get us going. So good. I love seeing those in the group. All right, so tonight we are going to be having a conversation with Chrissy Stroop. Chrissy Stroop is an author, a writer. She is an amazing activist, and I've known her for a couple of years now. She's just such a beautiful soul, and I love how she leverages story to make a difference in people's lives, to really help movements along towards justice. And that's exactly what we're talking about today, the power of story. So I'm going to invite Chrissy Stroop on with us, and we're going to begin this conversation. Hey, Chrissy, thanks so much for being here tonight.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me, Ashley, and for that very warm introduction. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, 100%. Well, we have had people talking about your talk all week long. People have been leaving comments about what they're interested in. And just as a reminder for everyone listening, we are going to be doing a live Q&A after Chrissy's talk. And so at any time during the talk, feel free to drop your comments. I will scroll back through and find your questions. Make sure you put a question mark in there. It's easier for me to spot when I'm skimming through all the comments. And we will get to those at the end. So, Chrissy, I am just going to let you take it away, and everybody enjoy the talk.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Ashley, and thanks everyone for your interest. I did look in the Facebook group and on Ashley's Facebook page and see some of the posts about this, look at some of your comments and questions, and I thought those were very insightful and challenging questions. And so hopefully we'll address some of them this evening. They're definitely going to come up to some extent in my talk, but I may not address all of them or exactly in the same form that they were posed, but I had them on my mind as I worked on what I wanted to talk about tonight. And I'm going to start with a little bit of my own story and, how it's kind of shaped me as someone who became a writer, someone who believes that stories have power and wants to use that power for good. And when you're giving a talk like this and you come up with a topic that you like, and you have to come up with a title months in advance, sometimes when you get down to really working on the talk a little bit later, you wish you could change the title or just tweak it a little bit. And in this case, I think I would have called it The Power and Pitfalls of Stories for Survivor Communities instead of just The Power of Stories. Because one point that I'm going to stress tonight is that any powerful force can be misused, can be used for evil as well as for good, right? And sometimes with perfectly good intentions can be accidentally used to do harm, just like, if you're not careful, you can burn yourself on a hot stovetop, even though hot stovetop is obviously useful for cooking and things like that. So when we talk about stories meaning, particularly when we're talking about stories in community and we're telling other people's stories, it's very important to consider issues like power dynamics, whose stories get to be told, whose voices and perspectives on those stories get to be told. And I think one of the most empowering things about coming out of a background that includes some kind of abuse, or out of a high control religious community where you're always subjected to controlling and manipulative behavior and what I would call at least low grade sort of spiritual and emotional abuse. Um, you end up with trauma, and you end up with, people have tried to tell your story for you, or tell you who you are, tell you what your story is, your entire life. And so it's when you find your own story, and it can help a lot when some people do talk about their stories in public, because you then realize that you're not alone. That's very important for many of us. That's an empowering thing. And so I'm going to talk about that, but I'm also going to talk about ways that stories can be misused, and how we can try to guard against that, and just some ideas that I have for telling stories in a way that does good for survivors, for survivor communities, and doesn't perpetuate harm. Those ideas are not comprehensive, of course, and I think it's something that hopefully we can further discuss in the Q&A. It's something that I'm still thinking about, and I've been thinking about, particularly since around 2016, when I started to really become more prominent on Twitter, thanks to a sort of weird series of circumstances in which my expertise in modern Russian history, in which I happen to have a PhD, and my background in the Christian right, and so knowledge of the Christian right, kind of came together because people were interested in both of those things around the time, of course, that Donald Trump got elected president. And at that time, I had already been, for a year and a half or so, really kind of trying to connect with, other survivors of evangelicalism on social media, and it just kind of really took off there. And I ended up becoming someone who was kind of right in the middle of early construction of online spaces for people who came to be known as ex-evangelicals, former evangelicals mostly, to come together and process through storytelling, sometimes using hashtags, sometimes in private groups like the ex-evangelical Facebook group, where I was an administrator for several years, and eventually needed to pull back from that responsibility for my own mental health. And I was doing a lot of that stuff pretty naive, and I learned a lot of stuff along the way. But I suppose in some ways it came naturally to me to get involved with trying to leverage social media to tell stories in a way that could bring people together to process trauma, and also hopefully change the public conversation so that maybe fewer people have to deal with as much trauma and abuse, or they can get help, or work their way out of it more easily than some people could if they didn't have these kinds of public conversations. Because I guess in some ways, I've always been a truth teller, someone who gravitates toward trying to tell the truth anyway. I think this is one of the values that was sort of accidentally instilled in me through my evangelical upbringing and education. Accidentally, in the sense that evangelicals, typically, and I'm talking about, right wing, mostly Donald Trump voting, mostly white evangelicals. And if you share a lot of the theology, but not, the abusive aspects of it, then, please understand I'm not talking about you. But in your typical evangelical background, somewhere on a spectrum from quiverful, which I was not, to megachurch, somewhat loosey goosey, but still pretty controlling evangelicalism. And I was more toward that end of it growing up. You get told that the truth is kind of the most important thing. We all have to accept the truth of Jesus Christ and his sacrifice and so forth as our means of salvation. And so I started to think that, okay, this is really, they're really serious about this. They want us to make sure that we know the truth, and we get others to know the truth too, because that's the only way to be free and be saved, and so forth. I now see that as, a very controlling kind of narrative and story of its own, that this is the only way for people to be. And of course, as we all know, it comes with a lot of other very strictly prescribed social roles. This is a very patriarchal sort of religious community, and one in which abuses of various kinds are common because of the way that the community protects the leaders, the more powerful people, especially white men, pastors, and so forth. Um, at first, I think, as a little kid, when I had this idea about, I never want to lie. I always want to tell the truth. I always want to be authentic. I was very naive about it, of course. And I started using it in somewhat, or letting myself be directed to be a truth teller in ways that sort of helped to perpetuate the unjust status quo rather than challenge it. I was a teacher's kid in a Christian school, and I became a teacher's pet in most of my classes and a tattletale. I would always, if people disobeyed the rules and I saw it, I would report that to the authorities because I really felt that as a Christian, that was what I had to do, and I always wanted to do the right thing. And now, of course, I realize there's a lot of nuances there. Yes, some things absolutely need to be reported to the authorities. But, things like if someone, is smoking marijuana, uh, especially if that someone is a minority because of the disproportionate racist policing that happened with the war on drugs, you probably shouldn't exactly rat on them. And funny little side story here. When I was in college, I was starting to deconstruct evangelicalism, but I was still dealing with this whole thing like, if I see someone break the rules, it's my duty to tell on them, even if I feel bad about it. So I actually was walking into a building once to go to class, and then I noticed this girl in front of me was smoking pot, and she threw her roach down on the ground, and I was like, oh no, what do I do? What do I do? And I called the campus police and told them that someone had been smoking pot on the way into the building. But I couldn't give them a good description or anything. I don't think anything happened. I'm sure they had a huge laugh after they hung up the phone. But I thought, every infraction, I guess what I'm trying to say is, after that evangelical socialization, everything was still very black and white for me, right? Wrong or right, in or out. And so part of my deconstruction was having to deconstruct that. Now, that growing up was an aspect of being a truth teller that I got praised for. When you become an enforcer for an authoritarian community, and particularly when you already have some privilege to start with, and I'm transgender. I was raised as a boy, so far as everybody perceived me that way. I always felt different, and I think that's probably where a little bit of my anti-authoritarian streak came from. But you get praised for doing things like that, trying to enforce the rules that protect the status quo. But then, as I got a little bit older, I realized there are other ways of telling the truth that were important to me, but that I would get criticized for harshly. So, for example, if my sister and I had a conflict about something, I would often feel like it was still unresolved and we needed to sort of talk our way through it. And I was trying to be a peacemaker. I mean, blessed are the peacemakers, right? So I felt we had to reach some kind of resolution that everyone could agree to, or that we simply had to come to some kind of compromise or at least agree about what happened. And I would just get told by my mom, by my aunt, by my sister to drop it, just drop it, just drop it. And honestly, probably a kid, a lot of these were pretty petty things that really probably could have just been dropped, no problem. But the attitude, I think, was a problem. But I was basically being told that my concerns didn't matter. And what was happening in my mind was that unresolved issues were being swept under the rug. Now, this is the kind of, truth-telling that evangelicals don't like. Another big thing there is, of course, the issue of doubt. You are not allowed to be honest about any doubts that you may have in things like inerrancy of the Bible, the righteousness of divinely ordained genocide, contradictions in the Bible, really anything along those lines, gets shut down pretty quickly. And so I would say, by my junior year of high school, I had read the entire Bible through for the first time. I started doing that when I was 16 years old. That ended up causing me to ask a lot of questions about the faith, and I think I was processing things in a very intellectual way, but that was partly a proxy for just feeling different and not being able to understand how I felt different and why I couldn't quite fit in with all the prescribed roles that were being presented to me. So I always felt different. And, and in some ways, even though I always tried to be an obedient kid, I ended up questioning authority, but I was always reluctant to do it. And I remember in high school learning about apologetics and being told things like, of course, if reason and evidence really does lead you away from the faith, then you should go where the truth is. But we're confident that won't happen. I began to, I think, understand on some level that there are some areas where evangelicals don't seem to be committed to the truth, even though they say that they are. And this created a lot of cognitive dissonance for me. I even remember a time when another sort of moment when I think I realized that the kind of high control community I was in prefers forced inauthenticity and posturing to being honest when you can't agree with the already set right answers of the community, or you can't fit into the roles that are prescribed to you, or you have doubts about something. I remember a local singer was doing a performance at our school, Heritage Christian School in Indianapolis, and she was going to sing a Nicole Nordeman song that some of you may remember if you know your Christian contemporary music. The song was called Fool for You, and it's about being a fool for Christ, even though some things in the Bible seem very unbelievable. And this woman, before she sang the song, she was leading up to it, giving it an introduction, and she said, and I apologize for the ableist language here, but this is what she said. She said, it's not possible to be too dumb to get into the kingdom of heaven, but it may be possible to be too smart. And I'm sitting there thinking, I thought you guys were committed to the truth, and also, being a smart kid had kind of become the cornerstone of my identity since I was a good academic performer. And then I remember also going to my pastor at that time about my doubts, and him at first seeming very sympathetic. He gave me an apologetics book to read. It wasn't Lee Strobel or Josh McDowell. It wasn't super famous, so I don't remember which one it was, but I do know it was in question and answer format. I went home and read it, and I still just didn't feel convinced about, some of the things in the Bible that were bothering me, and some of the things that just didn't seem like they could be inerrant or literally true. So I came back and told him that I was still struggling with doubts about this doctrine of inerrancy. And this is an instance that I remember, years later, I look back on it and think about it as one of spiritual abuse, because all of a sudden his tone changed dramatically. And he suggested that I must just be harboring sin in my life. That can be the only reason that the Holy Spirit isn't making it clear to me that obviously, a book that consists of some, 60 books put together over thousands of years and put into its final form through a blatantly political canonization process overseen by a Roman emperor who was using the faith for his own ends, was definitely, 100% true and inerrant in every respect, at least in the original manuscripts. Obviously, if you're living in the Holy Spirit, that's just obviously true. And if it's not obviously true to you, you are demonized. And he did indeed, go into some of that bondage breaker, binding the demons kind of stuff. And I think, this was the start of a very long, painful, and protracted period of deconstruction for me. I did not have that word at that time. I didn't know that's what I was doing, and I was trying very hard to stay in the fold. But it wasn't too long before I felt like that was a very manipulative thing. And I realized, that stories prescribed by other people are often used to control us. That's one kind of power that stories have in communities. They have the power to sort of, I think, create cohesion and bring communities together, but they also have the power to control, to manipulate and control people. Obviously, also not every story is true, and stories can be used in ways that um, I suppose I would say, respect our moral autonomy and that of other people, and they can be used to simply dismiss people who are inconvenient. If you're in an abusive or an authoritarian community or a relationship with someone who is trying to control you. Um, so I guess as an adult thinking back on this now, and it seems obvious, but I've understood that evangelicals absolutely really understand the power of stories and narratives, including the narrative that they're the only ones with the absolute truth, and that absolute truth means you have to check all these boxes like voting Republican, banning abortion, not being queer, not accepting that queer people can be Christians, and so on and so forth. Or you're not walking in the truth and you're not really in the club. And with that in mind, it's clear that the power of stories can be decoupled from things that are true and can be used to do harm to people. And so that's the background that I brought to the table when, in 2016, I started really connecting with other ex-evangelicals online and trying to do what I could to amplify ex-evangelical stories and stories about issues and abuse and control in evangelical communities. In a certain sense, I was applying the evangelical model of sharing one's testimony for a different end. You can say that it's a kind of bearing witness. And one thing that I do think is important for people who grew up in that kind of controlling, high control religious environment is to understand that the people who were in your life and the institutions that you were socialized in growing up, they've always told your story for you. And sometimes they force you into a mold that doesn't fit and they force you to become inauthentic. And at a certain point, to move on, it becomes necessary to confront that and try to find your own voice, your own story, which is difficult because it comes with a high social and psychological cost. You get a lot of pushback from those people, which can, of course, contribute to you doubting yourself. And you're probably also still saddled with all these kinds of internalized disciplinary mechanisms like fear that, well, maybe your doubts really just are demons manipulating you, stuff like that. And that's the thing, evangelicals and other high control sort of communities, they have the stories that they like, the stories, of the quote, good guys. And then if you can't fit into those, they have these stories for the bad guys, stories of, demonization, backsliding, being a temptress or a fallen woman, all kinds of stories to dismiss you and make your concerns about maybe some instance of abuse that you experienced or about just the roles that you're supposed to subscribe to. That's complementarianism or something like that. They'll tell your stories for you. So I think when I think about the power of stories for survivors, specifically of this kind of high control religious community, the first thing that comes to mind to me is the necessity of finding a way to reclaim our own stories and how empowering that can be to get to tell our stories ourselves and simply reject these labels and these framings, these narratives that, you're a backslider, you're a whore, you're a whatever. I mean, you've probably seen, or you may have seen some of these articles that are appearing in like Christianity Today, in recent years where they're talking about ex-evangelicals and completely misrepresenting us. Oh, there are all these people who just, they wanted to sin, so they left. They just want to have like lots and lots of illicit sex. That's really what it's all about. Um, I mean, it's hard to believe that they can even really believe such a simplistic narrative, but anything that's threatening has to get, its own kind of story in that community so that you don't have to deal with difference. So uh, that was sort of a very long way of describing my path to uh, finding stories to be a powerful thing. But now I want to talk about the pitfalls of using stories in survivors communities as well, things that we maybe need to try to avoid or just watch out for. Um, and so I'll be shifting into that at this point. So as I already said once, I think, like any kind of power, the power of stories can be used for good. It can be also misused or abused, and it can be used in ways that do harm accidentally. And being very naive when I started getting on social media and talking with a lot of other ex-evangelicals, I had to learn about some of the pitfalls the hard way. So we were all kind of processing trauma in public, and that's okay. I don't want to say anything that there's anything inherently wrong with that, but there are some dangers there where you might trust people a little too quickly. You might end up building a community that replicates the, the power structures of the community that you left before, but maybe or the sort of unhealthy dynamics, although maybe not empowering the same group. You might replicate fundamentalist dynamics. Definitely saw some of that happening, and you can develop a false sense of intimacy with people that you don't necessarily really know, all of which can be somewhat dangerous for your mental health, and sometimes for opening yourself up to the possibility of bullying and things like that as well. Unfortunately, when we talk about working with survivors communities and how to handle stories carefully and in ways that do good and not harm, I mean, we're talking about communities in which everybody is dealing with trauma, and healing has occurred to varying degrees. And even more than that, sometimes people's traumas or their trauma triggers and their responses to traumas can get crosswise, causing people to sort of tear each other apart, um, or to eat their own in a way. And over the years on social media and in the Facebook group, the support group that Blake Chastain and I and some other people built up, called Ex-Evangelical, we saw some of these things happen. Some of them happened to me, some of them happened to us. And if I had been more trauma informed, more informed about social justice and methods of organizing when I started, I'd like to think maybe some of this could have been avoided. And that's why I do want to talk about it here too. When we're talking about stories and their power, we have to realize that stories have the power to re-traumatize, to bring up really tough, really difficult emotions that maybe we didn't process as much as we thought we had, and sometimes people can end up lashing out at each other out of trauma. That's one of the bad things that can happen, and one of the things that can really surprise you and therefore destabilize you even more if it happens with people that you felt close to because you had developed this sort of false sense of intimacy through the original connection that you made. So, I would say that a lot of good did come out of hashtags that we used, which is kind of how we started building these communities on Twitter around 2016, 2017. Blake Chastain coined the hashtag Ex-Evangelical. He posted recently that the hashtag now is approaching 1 billion views on TikTok, which is amazing. So that hashtag has obviously had legs and has helped people to connect, who share a similar background. And there is a really important kind of validation that comes through connecting with people who really have been there and they get it. People who have had similar experiences. because working in these communities, I've talked to a lot of people. I've also experienced this myself, who felt like, oh, gee, I thought I might be the only person who felt that way. Like I thought maybe I was the only one who got really traumatized by being shown the Rapture movie, A Thief in the Night, at church when I was 7 years old. Or I thought I was the only person who, when I couldn't find my mom in the room where I thought she was, I thought the rapture happened and I got left behind. You see a lot of stories like that, where people are talking about religious trauma, and people sometimes, find each other through these hashtags, where people are just like, "Wow, it wasn't just me," and that I think is very validating and very important. It's really empowering sometimes to know that you're not alone in something. Um, and so I don't want to deny that that's a really good thing. But I do want to stress that it's not a substitute for therapy and self work. And I think that's part of what I didn't understand when I started engaging in this kind of mostly online community building. Um, and then, some other things came up with different sorts of hashtag campaigns that we were using to get stories out there. And at this time, and this is still true, I was thinking of telling these stories in public for a couple of reasons. One was that they're helpful for us as individuals who have experienced similar trauma to come together, realize that this is a big systemic issue that needs to be unpacked. It wasn't just me, and there was nothing wrong with me. And so it can be empowering for individuals and for communities that form to talk about these kinds of things. The other thing that I wanted to pursue through talking about these kinds of stories in public is possibly changing the national conversation about Christianity, and in particular evangelicalism and high control Christianity, the Christian right, um, and using these stories to expose harm, abuse, and to hopefully achieve some kind of accountability. Now, obviously, a lot of other people were doing that at the same time. A lot of people were doing that before me. And this whole period, of course, dovetails with the really big surge in 2017 of the Me Too movement and then the Church Too movement that was inspired, according to its creators, both by Me Too and by the hashtag that I launched in August 2017, hashtag Empty the Pews, where I was responding to evangelicals' silence on the racism in Charlottesville and Donald Trump's obvious complicity in that racism. I thought, maybe we could just call for people to leave evangelical churches and protest, thinking naively that maybe if I put this hashtag out there, a lot of people will do that. Well, that didn't happen, but it did kind of create this space for people to use that hashtag to talk about why they had already left those kinds of churches, whether for a different, healthier church or no church or a different religion or no religion. I was already saying at the time, let's not prescribe a one size fits all, endpoint there, but let's share these stories. That was a powerful moment. But I think at that time I was overestimating how quickly we might achieve some major social change through shifting the narrative. And so that led to disappointment as well. And I was also, I think, underestimating the power of the backlash and the narratives that protectors of the status quo, people who are opposed to social justice, would put out to try to reassert control. So to give you an example of what I mean there, we can take the hashtag Expose Christian Schools that I started in early 2019. And that one went pretty big. There were about 200,000 tweets in 2 or 3 days, as far as I recall. And part of that was because it happened at the same time as the Covington Catholic scandal that happened in Washington, D.C., where these white Catholic school kids confronted a Native American protester in a racist way. And so, I was watching this happen and thinking, wow, this is going to get media attention. This is really going to help shift the public conversation about children's rights and what's wrong with the kind of controlling environments that are fundamentalist and evangelical Christian schools and homeschooling communities. Um, and what happened was sort of that to some extent, but also not a lot of other things that weren't so great. So during that whole episode, I got contacted by a reporter from the New York Times, a guy named Dan Levin. So this reporter happened to be Jewish, and he wanted to do a piece, talking about this because he was actually a youth culture reporter, and he asked me how he might find some sources to talk to, and I suggested, why don't you just put out a tweet, and I'm sure you'll find some people to talk to. That was very naive of me. He ended up getting bombarded by thousands of anti-Semitic trolls who organized on 4chan to oppose the Exposed Christian Schools hashtag, and I still feel bad about that. It also ended up, we ended up with a situation where he did write a story, but it ended up being kind of a more milquetoast story than I think it otherwise might have been, kind of both sidesy story. Well, some people had great experiences in Christian schools, and some people had bad experiences in Christian schools. I simply did not understand how extreme and powerful online bullying can be about the kind of organization that alt-right internet communities have. And because of that, Dan had to deal with this terrible situation. And, I'm grateful that we got a story about it in the New York Times. But also, I feel like I really messed up in the way that I suggested he look for sources to talk to for the story, and it could have been better. Meanwhile, I was disappointed that, the cable news, the TV news, they didn't pick this up at all, except for Fox. Fox and Friends featured the Exposed Christian Schools hashtag twice so they could bash it as, something put out by these evil liberals who just want to discredit Christianity. They didn't trace it back to its origins or want to talk to anyone who was involved with the hashtag. They did not represent it as actual survivors of Christian schools sharing our stories, but they completely misrepresented it as, basically just disgruntled leftists and liberals doing an op against Christians. And there was no counter narrative to that was on, CNN or MSNBC or something. It just didn't happen. And I realized that, this narrative about Christianity and religion as basically good things is very powerful in United States institutions, and it's not something that is just going to crumble overnight. So we have to be realistic, plan better, and organize for the long game if we want to talk about what we can do on that, public front, informing the public, exposing, helping to create accountability. So, yeah, those are some of the pitfalls that I think we want to avoid when talking or when using stories to try to be empowering and to work for good. I've also experienced bullying individually as a result of this, including from people who were in that sort of early ex-evangelical online community that I was too quick to trust, and where, as I said, those sort of fundamentalist dynamics were replicated. There was very black and white thinking. There was a lot of gatekeeping, and at the end of the day, it was pretty trans misogynistic. I ended up having to come out as a trans woman earlier than I wanted to try to just sort of stop the division in the community. And I ended up feeling like I'd been very naive not to anticipate that something like that could happen. And, I've talked to people who've experienced things like that, who as a result gave up on survivors communities altogether. And I understand that response, though it still is not my response. It's just something, to be careful of. But so to get back to what the goals of, storytelling for survivors communities are, at least in my mind, I'm thinking about both individual and community empowerment on the one hand, and accountability and social change on the other. the question after all of this experience and mistakes that is on my mind is, how do we pursue those goals while minimizing harm to survivors, as well as harm to other people who just may get caught up in it, as like happened with the New York Times journalist. And I also want to stress that, not everyone needs to pursue both of these goals. Not everyone needs to share their story publicly. Going public is very much a personal decision. And I don't think that people should be trying to make that for other people or putting pressure on anyone. And those who do share publicly, um, I think that you shouldn't feel pressure, and do it if it feels safe enough for you, or you are willing to face the backlash and consequences of doing that. And it's good that we have people who are willing to do that, because it helps us find each other. It may help us to eventually affect some social change. But again, it's not something that everyone has to do. So let's see. I think I'm getting a little short on time, so let me skip over some of this. I realized through kind of that experience and some reading that I did later, particularly that experience with the Exposed Christian Schools hashtag, that stories about the kinds of institutions and stories that challenge dominant power regimes and paradigms in our society are referred to as counter stories by conflict specialists, conflict resolution specialists, and counter stories are difficult to get a hearing for. I read a book recently called The Neutrality Trap: Disrupting and Connecting for Social Change by Bernard Meyer and Jacqueline Infant Guzman. It was a really good book. They are professional conflict intervention specialists, and they have this to say. And so I think before we, get all gung ho about sharing all kinds of stories, our own stories, other stories that might be out there, this is something that we should take seriously. So they wrote in that book, effective dialogue requires a safe space and structure for storytelling. When people share a counter story, one that threatens a dominant narrative, they often pay a very high price. People who share stories of sexual harassment or racism are often subjected to marginalization, trauma, demotion, and dismissal, even when using channels supposedly set up for this very purpose. Counter stories have a high potential to change the status quo and connect us with those who are different, and yet they are usually suppressed, ignored, or discouraged by those in positions of power. So simply by bringing in that quote, I want to stress that, going public is always a very big decision that will have consequences. And it's something that should always be weighed, and that people can only make a decision on, I think, individually based on all the factors in their own lives. It's not something that other people can prescribe for you. At the same time, the reason that these stories tend to be suppressed by defenders of the status quo is that they do have the potential power to affect real change. And sorry about the little background noise there. My roommate had a doctor's appointment that went a little bit late, and she needed to come pick up the dog and take the dog out. And now they're going to be gone for the rest of the event. But anyway, sorry about that. Right. So putting counter stories out there, I think, is still very important. If we do want to see people held accountable eventually, but you have to realize it's going to be a long, tough battle. Take steps to protect your own mental health. And remember that your stories ultimately belong to you, and you choose what to do with them. So at the end of the day, where am I going with all of this? How do we relate to the stories that bring us together in survivors' communities, and what do we do with them? So the first major point that I kind of want to sum up with all these things that I wanted to bring together and talk about today is that to reclaim our own stories, which I think is an important aspect of healing, it helps to know that we're not alone. So the sharing of stories in public that have something to do with religious trauma or survivors' trauma. Um, they help us know we're not alone, and that's very important. At the same time, remember moral autonomy and boundaries. Don't share stories that aren't your own. Don't pressure people to share if they're not ready. It's easier for privileged people or people who have a higher degree of, safety to be able to share stories publicly. So, of course, keep that in mind. And I want to say, though, that, to reclaim your story doesn't mean that you have to tell it publicly. You can still take your own story back for yourself. And it can mean simply intentionally reflecting on how you see yourself versus, what roles were prescribed for you by others in your past that you now reject as they tried to fit you into their stories that they want to tell. This can be a personal project for self-work and reflection on who you are, where you've come from, what you've overcome, where you see yourself going in the future has value, whether or not you share your story publicly, and can be an important part of a journey of self-discovery and self-affirmation. And one other takeaway that I came up with is that high control communities place us in stories that leave little room for character development. But leaving those communities behind, we can embrace the uncertainty that results from that, which at first can be very scary. And we can become dynamic protagonists in our own lives. We can really begin to grow as individuals and to consider where our stories might take us in the future. So those are the thoughts that I've brought to the table this evening. And now I'd like to hear your responses, your questions, and have a conversation about this. Again, I think, this is far from a comprehensive approach to the topic, just kind of a distillation of experiences that I've had over the last few years and some conclusions that I drew from them. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Chrissy. And I appreciate that you focus not just on the benefits of telling story, which I think a lot of us have heard about some of the benefits. And you did go over those, and those are powerful. But you also gave us some really important warnings and guidelines to understand that there are risks with sharing our stories and that it is our decision as survivors. Nobody should pressure somebody else to share their story, and we shouldn't share people's stories on their behalf. I know as an advocate, I am told lots and lots of stories, and it is hard sometimes to keep those stories to myself because I'm like, wow, I just so want to expose this dangerous person. And of course, reporting to the police if there's children involved, those types of things. But there are some cases where we just have to wait until the person feels comfortable, if they feel comfortable, and realize that we can't take away someone else's power by trying to be just like those high control groups and trying to narrate their story on their behalf. Whew, this is so good. Thank you so much, Chrissy. And guys, we are
going. I mean, you're right. When you are an advocate, you hear so many things that you can't act on, and it's distressing. But sometimes you also get stories that you get permission to tell, or you can tell in an anonymized form, and that's okay because they help to illustrate points. But you also often know, okay, there are predators in this community, and currently I cannot do anything about them. I know who they are. I may participate in the whisper network, and that's a whole other kind of topic. But I think gossip is good, or can be, right?
Yes.
It can like any power, gossip can be used for good or evil.
Exactly.
But anyway, sorry.
No, that makes so much sense, and I'm glad that you said that because I think that's one thing that people often say when you try to tell your story, is it's gossip, and gossip is wrong, or it's a sin. And like you said, quote unquote, gossip can be used in good or negative ways. And it just kind of depends on the situation. But everybody, now we're going to open things up to have a Q&A. This is your opportunity to ask Chrissy, your questions about story. Now, I've already kind of polled the group and my social media, and so I have a couple questions to sort of get us started, but I am going to be looking back through. And the first one that I'd love for you to answer for us, Chrissy, is we had a question about, can you describe what evangelicalism is to somebody who maybe didn't identify as evangelical and hears that term and is like, well, I wonder what an evangelical is, but before I can understand what that is, I really need to understand what evangelical means. So can you kind of define that for some of us?
Sure. It's a tricky thing to define. I think, some people try to define it sort of normatively or by theology. And that
Yeah.
doctrine of biblical inerrancy that I talked about is one thing that is usually like prescribed in evangelical institutions. Like if you teach or attend an evangelical college, you're usually expected to believe that, right? So literal resurrection, literal virgin birth, everything God does is good by definition. So if he told the ancient, Jewish people to slaughter all the Amalekites, including the children, and they did that, which, by the way, most of that history is not actually historical. But then that was good, because when God says genocide is okay, it is. All of that stuff is very sort of tricky to deal with. But that's part of the doctrine of inerrancy. I would say I also think of evangelicalism more sort of in sociological terms.
Yeah.
So evangelicalism in the United States, the way I think about it is, so it's mostly white conservative Christian community. They mostly subscribe to this doctrine of inerrancy, but there's a lot of other sort of social things that tie them together. And there's also a lot of, I could list off a number of denominations that are and definitely aren't. But when we talk about evangelicalism, we talk about it in contrast to like mainline Protestant denominations, which are also overwhelmingly white and still majority voted for Donald Trump, by the way, in both 2016 and 2020. So Episcopalians, United Church of Christ people, Methodists, we might think of them as liberal Christians. They're not all really that liberal, just FYI. But they do tend to have more tolerance, more diversity. They're more liberal on some issues. Evangelicals tend to be, young earth creationism because biblical inerrancy, right? Abortion should be banned. White evangelicals are the only demographic in the United States of which an overwhelming majority thinks abortion should be banned in basically all cases. And that didn't used to be the case before the late 1970s/early 80s. It's totally manufactured controversy that has become so a powerful story, in its own right. They think that the biblical worldview should dictate policy for the country, so they want to, keep queer people from having rights and so forth. That's the kind of Christian that I'm talking about. And, that covers I'll give you some, examples. That would cover things from like Southern Baptists to most Wesleyans and Nazarenes to many Calvinist and Reformed churches, so they might like to think of themselves as a little bit more, in fairness, they sometimes are. Probably Presbyterian Church in America, but not Presbyterian Church USA, because that's a mainline denomination. Well, there is, of course, also the National Association for Evangelicals that was founded in 1943. And even though there's been a lot of like racial reconciliation attempts since then, it was founded as a whites-only organization. So a lot of your charismatic and Pentecostal type churches they fall under this umbrella now, though many other evangelicals kind of looked at them askance for a long time, but they really became kind of mainstreamed in the 80s and 90s. Right. And you think now of someone like Ted Haggard, who was so important, and influential in the George W. Bush years as the head of the National Association of Evangelicals. He is a charismatic pastor, I believe a Pentecostal specifically pastor. So it's a big umbrella, right? But it tends to be white conservative Christians who think that they should define what America is. And if other people don't love it, they should leave it.
Right.
or just
Yeah.
shut up.
Yeah. That that makes a lot of sense. And we just got a question. I think this is maybe clarifying on that question. It's would Mormonism be considered evangelical? And I think just a quick answer on that, kind of Christianity is almost like a tree with a bunch of branches. So particularly the Christianity in the West, I'm not going to talk about in other places because I don't have a lot of knowledge there, but you have sort of like the Catholic tradition, and then split off from that was Protestants. And then Protestants have mainline, which is usually Episcopal, Methodist, Lutheran. I'm sure there's Presbyterian, there's a couple others. And then from those, you had other denominations, usually like Baptist, and some of those branches. And then Mormonism and Jehovah's Witness, they call themselves under the umbrella of Christianity, but they use very different texts than Christianity generally does. They include other books. So I'm not sure that they're really defined as evangelical technically, though they could, perhaps if you're looking at it from like a voting block standpoint, maybe. But if you're looking at it from like a church history thing, they're probably a separate branch.
Yeah, I mean, I would say evangelical adjacent or part of the Christian right. We have very similar high control group dynamics. And so, there's been a lot of ex-Mormons and ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who participate in ex-evangelical conversations. But evangelicals themselves, starting in like around 1965, started putting out all this anti-cult literature and declared Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses to be cults. That's part of the reason I don't actually use the term cult. I prefer high control religious groups. This is not something I police in other people because the term cult is so popular. I could never put that genie back in the bottle, even if I really wanted to try. And, I'm not really big on policing other people's use of language too much, or particularly when they're talking about their own stories and their own identity. But if we look at sort of the history of the discourse around the term cult, it's basically groups that evangelicals didn't like. And, and they lump in everything from New Age sort of movements and new religious movements centered around gurus with Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses who, are actually very similar, but just radically different interpretation of the Bible, but similar social dynamics at the end of the day. The social theology is very similar. Is it fair to call a group a cult just because it's not Christian enough by certain Christian standards? I'm not defending Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm just saying that evangelicals, by jumping on that word cult and making it a big thing from the 1960s and really picking up in the 1970s and 80s, they managed to, I think, help make themselves more mainstream than they deserve to be because they're just as abusive and controlling. So, I don't use the word cult.
Yeah. I think that's really helpful because in my talk last week, we talked about the definition of a cult, and there are so many different definitions. And like you said, some of it can be evangelical Christians saying anything that's not them is a cult. We got some good comments here, people saying that they grew up thinking that Catholicism was a cult. I grew up thinking that too. There's a lot of language that doesn't mean high control that can be attributed to the term cult. And like you said, sometimes it's not a helpful term unless you're really defining what you mean by it.
Yeah. And, from more like an academic religious studies perspective, cult doesn't have a lot of meaning as a term if you try to use it in an academic way, because what it pretty much means whenever someone uses it is this religious group that I don't like. Yeah. So I also don't like a lot of those groups, but I just don't think that the language of cult is very useful.
No, I hear you on that for sure. Let's see. We had a question come up through here. So it says, Chrissy, what do you have to say about telling our stories in the form of fiction, poetry, and or art?
I think that self-expression for survivors in general can just be a really valuable thing, and that art and fiction and poetry in general are just wonderful, expressions of the human spirit. So, I mean, I'm certainly all for it. And when you do that too, you don't have to share it with anybody. You don't have to create something and think, oh, it has to be a masterpiece, or it has to hang in a museum someday, or be published in an anthology, or it has no value. If it has value to you, and maybe a few people that you want to share it with, and in your more intimate circles, then it has value. So I think a lot of people find self-expression to be therapeutic on some level. And I think many of us, connect with it when other people do the same thing. So yeah, there's some really good like evangelical memoirs out there. But there's also some good fictionalized, stories, books that have come out in recent years, and some older than that, that kind of capture sort of, I think, a typical. They capture the evangelical ethos, and they put it in human stories that are fictional but still very relatable. I mean, I'm all for fiction.
Yeah, 100%. It can be a great healing tool, a great way to kind of say things through metaphor, and yeah, it's a really powerful medium. So Chrissy, we had two questions that kind of came through in our discussions earlier this week, and they sort of overlap. And one is somebody asking, like, how can you actually get other people to listen to your story? And then kind of coupled with that is, how do you move past it if people deny the truth of your story? So one, how do you get them to listen? And then two, what do you do if they listen and they deny your experience?
Mm-hmm. So in 2017, when I started the hashtag Empty the Pews, I had exactly that first question on my mind. Evangelicals don't listen. They just deflect, or they just give you the silent treatment. And so we're not going to change them by telling them, hey, you're a bunch of hypocrites, or, hey, here's what's wrong with your communities and your theology. And so to my mind, getting them to change their minds wasn't really a goal to work toward on a large social scale. Sometimes through the power of story, when you are invested in someone, when you care about someone, people can change their minds individually. I don't think it's something scalable. People talk about how LGBTQ rights made headway, same-sex marriage became possible because a lot of people realized that they knew queer people, and they knew people who wanted to get into a same-sex marriage, and so they changed their minds. That can definitely happen, but it's not something that happens through public storytelling for the most part. I mean, I don't think it hurts. I think it can help. But, bigots, abusers, people with authoritarian personalities, they're not going to change their minds when confronted with harmful facts, particularly if, they have a history of getting away with just denying that anything is wrong with their faith, or anything that people have accused them of is true, and they get off the hook for it. You're not going to change their minds. And so Empty the Pews became about exposing them rather than changing their minds, talking past them to the public rather than talking to them. At the end of the day, you can't force anybody to change their mind. I mean, there are still serious divisions in my family that are painful to me, because I had to choose between a smooth relationship with my family or being my authentic self. And ultimately, not being authentic was killing me. I mean, I had so much suicidal ideation for so many years. So I have a pretty good relationship with my parents now. I'm lucky in that respect. It's the result of a lot of hard conversations. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. But some other family members, and one in particular that I have in mind, not so much. And it's complicated with a lot of my relatives. Oh, when I talked about gatekeeping earlier, I actually did have in my notes, but then I realized that I kind of needed to get to the end. So I mentioned that some people actually will demand either that you do cut off your family or you don't cut off your family. And this is kind of gatekeeping is just so unhelpful to developing a supportive survivor community. It's something that unfortunately tends to happen. But when I said gatekeeping, that was something that I have in mind. That's always a very personal issue, is, well, my family, my parents, they don't believe me. They push back every time I try to have a serious conversation about them. Do I keep a relationship with them? Do I keep it the same, or do I change the relationship? That's, no one can tell you what to do there. The therapist can maybe help you assess all of the factors in your own life that you know about that other people wouldn't know about, and help you realize what might be best for you. Of course, it's always painful and difficult to cut off, people from your childhood.
Yes.
Sometimes it is the best thing to do, but nobody can just. I just don't get the gatekeeping. You can't just tell everybody, like, oh, your parents are still evangelicals and they voted for Donald Trump. Well, if you still have any kind of relationship with them, then that's wrong and bad, and you're bad, and you don't belong in our community. Or the opposite. Like, you can't do that. That's, have some respect for people's process
Mm,
and their moral autonomy.
that makes a lot of sense. I think, again, it goes back to the story that we were told in these high control groups is that we get to make the decisions for you. The group gets to make the decisions. This is what you have to do. And anything outside of that is wrong. And part of taking back our own story and our own narrative and writing the next chapters for us is deciding what happens next, deciding who we let in our life and who we don't. And that is complex and it is a big decision, and it's not going to be the same for every person. And so I really
Mm-hmm.
appreciate you talking about gatekeeping. So I have two other questions that I see here. One is, as far as your personal story, you mentioned that you are a trans woman. And were there stories that helped you find your voice in that? I know you were um, pressured and pushed in the corner to kind of be publicly outed. Were there stories that you found solace in as you were experiencing all of that?
Yeah, I mean, it took me a long time to realize that I was queer at all. And then once I did, I realized pretty quickly that I was trans, over a period of, I guess, a few months. But um, so part of my story is that as a young child, I already somehow just felt different, and I could never put my finger on how. And I wanted to always be that obedient kid, and my parents could just look at me funny sometimes, and I would start crying. I mean, like, if I thought I had done something wrong, they didn't need to spank me usually. Though I occasionally did get the wooden spoon. My sister got it more. Um, uh, but I felt, different, and I think that's where this anti-authoritarian streak that I do have, that ultimately prevailed, sort of came from, because I couldn't figure out how to fit myself comfortably into this exact world that I was being, socialized in. But I think that's also why, as a kid, I already just became very cerebral and learned to live in my head all the time. So I always tried to solve everything as like a kind of academic issue. I had to figure out in high school if Christianity was true or not, if it rationally stood up or not. To me, that was like an intellectual problem. Um, I think a lot of the processing that I was doing then and after that was important to me, but it was also sort of a place where I could kind of like push my feeling of difference onto that. Like, if I just solved this, that would solve everything. I and I didn't have the language growing up of being transgender. I heard that, or I mean, I learned, from like movies and things, that there are these people called transvestites and cross dressers, and but they were really feminine and they're only sexually attracted to men, and so I didn't, um, I didn't particularly identify with that. I did always identify with strong female characters and literature and movies and that sort of thing. And I didn't really want to do like a lot of the stuff that the men in the family did. And it's not that this stuff is inherently male or female or masculine or feminine, right? But it's more about socialization. Like they all want to go off and play golf. I'm like, golf? That sounds like the most boring thing ever.
I'm with you on that. Like, wow. And watching it on TV is even worse, I think.
I know. They also wanted to watch it on TV. Like, why? I mean, a lot of times, when the men in the family were watching golf on TV and the women were doing whatever, I would just go off to a bedroom by myself and read a book. But I did pretty much manage to avoid learning how to play golf for my entire life. I had to get one lesson in the short game once. But anyway, I guess I got a little bit sidetracked from the question. So yeah, I didn't have models for how I felt about myself, right? So I didn't really know how I felt about myself, and I was just trying to stay focused on the sort of like the academic questions of my deconstruction, and focused on academics. And so after college, I taught English and Russia for a year. Then I went into grad school to get a PhD in modern Russian history, and after that, I was teaching in a Russian university for a few years, the one that used to run the Stanford and Moscow study abroad program before, U.S. Russian and Western Russian relations just really went down the tubes, and way before the war in Ukraine, which is so depressing to me. I mean, seriously, I know how to pick them, right? Why did I have to study Russian history? Well, I'll tell you the answer. Actually, it's because I went on 2 evangelical short-term mission trips to Russia.
Of course. I also went on a missions trip to Russia.
Oh, wow. We have to talk about that sometime.
Yeah, we do.
But yeah, so I was in Russia and I got into like a polyamorous dating relationship with this queer Russian woman. And she was teasing me a lot about like, why did I have so many friends that were lesbians and whatever, this and that. And I was like, what, that's not normal, like, but she helped me. She pointed me to some stories and, some like YouTube content and stuff that eventually helped me to understand that, yeah. And to just like, some just like fictional movies, right, that captured queer stories. And I learned that there's so much more diversity to being queer than I had ever been given a chance to really understand growing up. And then I realized that, that's how I fit in. That's, yeah.
Wow.
So.
Wow. Yeah, I think being able to broaden your perspective through story can be really helpful, whether it's in like a survivor format or just as like a personal identity format. It's hard to make sense of ourselves when we're not able to compare it to others because we're such social humans, as social creatures. It's not that we can't figure out ourselves kind of in isolation, but there is just something about stories and all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know if we really could exist completely in isolation. I don't know that we would figure ourselves out.
No, you're probably right about that. Yeah, I think there is kind of that bouncing off of other people and just the input that allows us to think differently about ourselves. Last question, and this is a quick one. So somebody asked about books and stories that you would recommend. And I know you have the Empty the Pews books. Maybe tell people what that's about. And then if you have any other suggestions of books that might be good for survivors thinking about sharing their story or having recently shared their story and wanting some support.
Yeah, so Empty the Pews, Stories of Leaving the Church is this co-edited anthology of essays that I did with my friend Lauren O'Neill. And we got together a very diverse group of writers, some first-time writers, some, already celebrated figures in the literary world. And we got a foreword for it written by Frank Schaeffer, so who obviously has some pull in like ex-evangelical communities. And yeah, published it ultimately with a small press based in Indianapolis. And I really like a lot of the stories that we collected for that book. We wanted to capture different experiences of high control Christianity. There's stories of ex-Catholics, ex-Mormons, mostly ex-evangelicals and people from different generations, different racial backgrounds. We talk about, well, not we, but the authors in the book talk about immigrant communities that they were a part of, and for example, how when one of the authors moved from, I'm forgetting off the top of my head which Latin American country, but somewhere in Latin America to Florida, Miami, Florida, her family converted from Catholicism to Pentecostal evangelicalism because that's what the community was doing there.
Got it.
And there's also a story by a really fascinating, smart young woman from Singapore who grew up with, the American style prosperity gospel there in that kind of church, and not just with, that style, but actually with lots of like sermons on tape and books from American prosperity gospel preachers. So the international reach was another thing that we wanted to look at. So yeah, I'm biased, but I think it's a I think it's a good book.
Yeah. And that's Empty the Pews, and people can find that on Amazon, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can find it basically anywhere that you sell or that you buy books. But
Okay.
there's a lot of really good books out there, kind of dealing with processing that particular evangelical background. There's a lot of people, even though it's a history, it's not at all dry. A lot of people really connected with Kristen Kobes Dumay's book Jesus and John Wayne
Yeah, I've
on like
heard
a
good
personal
things.
level. I certainly did. A lot of people found part of their own story in there. If you grew up evangelical in late 20th century America, you'll probably be like, oh yeah, I did that. I did that. Oh yeah. So that's one that I'm not sure that's what she was trying to do, but she did it. I mean, it's a very thorough history too, very well documented, lots of notes, and yet written in a just really compelling narrative format. So that's certainly powerful. Um, it's an older one, but one that has meant a lot to me is Jesus Land by Julia Shares. Um, she talks about surviving some pretty severe abuse in an offshore, troubled teen industry type school, Christian run
Yeah.
in the Dominican Republic. A friend of mine, Deirdre Seguchi, is also a fabulous writer, and she was later, there also experienced pretty serious abuse at Escuela Caribe, and she's writing a memoir on that now that I'm sure is going to be very good. Uh, Gosh, I know there's so many more examples that. Oh, um, Gloria Beth Amadeo has a memoir coming out very soon that I was able to get an advanced copy of that, I think a lot of people who grew up evangelical will identify with. It's called God's Ex-Girlfriend. It's really good.
I love that title.
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh,
wow.
and of course, Pure by Linda K. Cannon is going
Yes.
to resonate with a lot of people with some kind of sexual trauma from purity culture.
Yeah. No, those are all really
Um,
good recommendations. And yeah, thank you so much for that. And I just want to encourage everybody. Chrissy has so many amazing resources just through following her on Twitter. The conversations and the thoughts that you put out really make me think. They really challenge the way I look at the world. And I feel like your social media is just very intelligent, and you are always uplifting the stories of other people, which I love about you. I've seen that from the beginning, and I know you've uplifted my story in a variety of ways, and I'm grateful for that. So please, everybody, I think your handle is on Twitter is at C_Stroop. Is that right?
yeah, that's
Okay.
correct. Yeah, and thanks, Ashley. Yeah, I try to, well, let's put it this way. When I really started working to try to build ex-evangelical connections online, it never occurred to me to only be all about self-promotion. I do self-promotion, everybody does, but I thought if we do want to use this to affect social change, then there has to be collective visibility. It doesn't matter how many individual people might gain some degree of fame. An individual memoir is a flash in the pan. no matter how good it is, no matter how many copies it sells. But 200,000 tweets in 2 days is a movement.
Yeah.
And now the media didn't exactly pick up on it very well, but we got a
Right,
couple
right.
write-ups in the New York Times and the Associated Press. But you know, that I think is the path to breaking through has to go through collective visibility. So it can never be about just any one person's stories.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Joining together, I think our stories are stronger collectively. Thank you so much, Chrissy. This has been really enlightening. I know people have really enjoyed it. Thank you all for hanging out with us.